Senator McLucas. Senator Ludlam.
Thanks very much, Mr President. The Greens will also be supporting this bill for very similar reasons to those identified by Senator McLucas. It's probably a bit of a rare thing for the Australian Greens to get up and announce that we're supporting a government bill involving regulation of nuclear technology. Just wanted to point that out. Participated in a brief. So much heckling. Don't make me change my mind. Through you, President. We're all appreciating each other today. I will put on the record a couple of comments and concerns about the narrowness of the drafting of the bill, but the fact is, as Senator McLucas has expressed, this does improve regulation of a sector that does have potential to cause enormous environmental and social harm and enormous harm to public health. And I guess it's worth acknowledging at the outset that the separation between the regulator and the regulated in this country has often been dangerously close. That we saw in instances that I was following with whistleblowers at ANSTO's radioisotope facility in Sydney, this what extraordinarily, to my mind, amounted to regulatory capture, where whistleblowers who were trying to put real dangers to workers' health on the public record were being attacked and eventually sacked or set aside. And that we saw under the previous government some quite welcome reforms that moved the regulator more to an arm's length basis from those that they were regulating. And in my view, not in a big melodramatic way, but in small but important ways, this bill continues that process of giving the regulator a freer hand at regulating this extraordinarily dangerous technology. Through increasing transparency and accountability, through powers to require licence holders to produce information, powers to issue the improvement notices within a set time frame, to be able to issue direction, again, in the Senator McLucas's comments about what happens in an emergency where the Act is basically silent or the regulations are silent, where it may not be the case that ARPANSA has time to go through formal processes of issuing an instruction or a direction, but effectively needs to bring its expertise as a regulator to bear on an unforeseen, potentially very risky or threatening event. I think those amendments are sensible. Noting ANSTO's reservations, nonetheless, we're pleased to support those amendments here. There is a very narrow definition in the bill, however, of prescribed legacy site to which the Act applies. I might take up a bit of time before we debate Senator Day's committee stage amendment to just put a couple of questions to the Minister and her advisers about the definition of prescribed legacy site and what's in and what's out. I suspect it's no surprise to the Minister that I'll be doing that. There were questions that I raised during the brief inquiry into which I teleconferenced a couple of weeks ago, and felt like I came out of the hearing without much more information than I went in. So hoping that a little bit of preparation and a bit of work's been done in the meantime would be great. There are no specified outcomes for reducing contamination at legacy sites. So although we've got a broader range of places and powers brought into ARPANSA's ambit, there don't appear to be any benchmarks about, for example, dose thresholds at sites. Senator McLucas put quite correctly, our ambition where it comes to radiation exposure, ionising radiation exposure to human beings or to the wider environment, our ambition is to minimise that exposure to the point where it is imperceptible. Because the literature for so many years internationally has been that there is no safe dose. You cop a risky dose. Airline pilots and aircrew get a dose of ionising radiation when you park 10 kilometres above the surface of the Earth. You get a dose of ionising radiation if you stay out exposed to the sun for too often. You get those kind of doses just from being a human being alive on the planet, being exposed to stray cosmic rays from time to time, but that there is no safe dose. And so anything at all that we can do to reduce those additional doses that are being effectively forced on people without their consent from industrial exposure, whether in the workplace where the workforce, you presume, is properly trained, they are given an understanding of the risks of exposure to ionising radiation, but also downstream of uranium mines, non-consensual doses of these harmful ionising materials that we need to minimise, and we need to minimise down towards zero, because any additional exposure, the way that it was put to me in the literature years ago when I first came across this technology and was trying to understand what is going on at a biochemical level, is that it's like a machine gun fire inside the cell, inside the nucleus of the cell. Maybe something important gets hit, maybe it doesn't. But once that that cancer has started or once those other damage has been done to the DNA, particularly in children or into fetuses in utero, you can't claw it back. There is no way that you can heal somebody once that damage has been done, and that it takes one decay track through one cell to cause cancer is, I guess, the literal understanding of why it is that there is no safe dose. Yes, we are exposed to ionising radiation just in the course of our normal lives, living on a planet that is mildly radioactive, but that everything that we can do to force those additional exposures back towards zero is important. And so people living in the vicinity of uranium mines, either operating ones or closed mines in the Alligator Rivers region, for example, the Northern Territory, extremely distressed to read credible research from a couple of years back that showed the incidence of cancer amongst Aboriginal people in those host communities around the closed Alligator Rivers mines in the NT that were operated in the 50s and 60s was double that of background populations also, or other populations in the area. That's how serious it is. I'll get to the wider consequences. I guess it's probably appropriate when we come to debating Senator Day's amendments about how this is precisely the wrong time to be ripping the lid off and opening the door to wider expansion into nuclear technology. The evidence is out there, not because the Greens say so. The industry itself is starting to front up to the consequences of just how much trouble it's in overseas. But I'll hold those comments off until we get to the committee stage. We would be, I'll just foreshadow to give your advisors a bit of time in case the material's not immediately at hand, to get an inventory of what existing sites are included through the amendment that we're discussing today, and those that aren't. So, for example, my understanding, which wasn't changed, Jenny, during the inquiry of a couple of weeks ago, was that the Act does not cover, for example, contaminated sites around Maralinga or other areas of nuclear weapons testing, where Australian service personnel and Aboriginal people from Central and Northwestern Australia were bombed, were exposed to ionising radiation and to fallout, fission products in fallout, by an ally. And I would still note that those veterans, and I think it is appropriate in this year where we are commemorating the sacrifice of veterans in conflicts into which we've sent them. In Australia, the atomic veterans are not eligible for a gold card because they were bombed by an ally. If they had been exposed to radiation from Imperial Japanese forces or from any of the other forces that we faced during the Second World War, they would be automatically eligible for a gold card. Because their exposure occurred by being bombed by nuclear weapons deployed by an ally, Australian uranium basically fired upon them in Central Australia by the British government. They're not eligible and they're dying one by one, and that cohort diminishes year by year. These are the sort of risks that we're talking about, and as far as I'm aware, I'd be delighted to be proven wrong. Maralinga and the other nuclear weapons test sites aren't covered. They're not brought into the ambit of the regulator. Port Pirie, Wild Dog, Radium Hill, Rum Jungle. Radioactive contamination in this country goes back way further than most people think, certainly further than I thought. Early radium workings that go back way before the development of nuclear weapons or nuclear power industry. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why it is important to comment, I guess, and pass remark when we're seeing this kind of regulation coming through the Senate, was that nuclear accidents and nuclear contamination has a start time. Often you can pinpoint, as they were able to pinpoint to within a few seconds of the reactors at the Fukushima site on Japan's Pacific coast, going into meltdown on 2011. These accidents and these contamination and exposure sites have a start date, but they have no end date. There are still contamination legacy issues at Radium Hill, which was contaminated more than 100 years ago. There are still contamination issues at by today's standards, relatively small uranium workings in the Alligator Rivers region that were mined out, closed down, rehabilitated as far as the authorities of the day were concerned decades ago, that are still leaching materials into the wider environment. And ionising radiation is invisible. It doesn't tell you that it's there. You can't see it unless you're carrying a Geiger counter around with you You don't know that it's there, and that's why these sites are so dangerous. So I'm very keen to know of any of those sites that I listed, whether they are caught by this bill, these so-called orphan sites where state regulation is either completely absent or patently inadequate, whether they will be brought within this bill, and what it would mean if they were. What are the obligations that arise? One of the questions I put during the brief committee hearing was, why are there no cost implications in this bill? If we're going to see a higher level of accountability and a higher level of rehabilitation of these orphaned contaminated sites, surely that's going to cost money. Protecting people, cleaning up the radioactive aftertaste of these sorts of operations does cost money. It's an unavoidable consequence which is often not factored in. It's almost never factored in at any point of the nuclear fuel chain. But I was a bit curious and maybe even a bit perplexed to see why there were no cost implications for this bill, because that to me would imply that nothing is in fact going to change on the ground. Again, Minister, through you, Mr President, if I'm wrong about that, I'd be very, very happy to stand corrected. We're also interested to know, and I'll go into this again a little bit in the committee stage unless the Minister wants to address these comments in her closing remarks, about the definition of a prescribed legacy site. It's not entirely clear to me what a site means. Mine, processing facility, research facility. It's clear in some parts of the amendments which sites are included based on their management by a Commonwealth entity, where the institutional jurisdiction is how you define whether a site is caught or not, and that's reasonably clear. But what about some of these other orphan sites where ownership is not entirely clear? If it's not possible, and we chose in the end not to bring forward a committee stage amendment to try and bring all the sites within AMBIT's, within UPANZA's ambit as a regulator, but that it may in fact be a wiser course to lift the standards of state and territory regulation and create that consistency around the country where it is lacking at the moment. Anyway, I'll confine my comments to the clauses as they're outlined in the bill. Senator Day, I think, has actually done us a bit of a favour in bringing his amendment forward. The Greens certainly won't be supporting it, but it is a good opportunity to look at the consequences of what would happen if the chamber did support those amendments. And in the meantime, I gather that these amendments have been in the works for a long time, that a lot of work goes in behind the scenes to bringing them forward. I acknowledge the government and those public servants who brought these amendments forward and commend it to the chamber.